What if your salt jar has been waiting for something? Not just salt, but a tiny object, one that whispers intention, and wakes up the flow you didn't know had gone quiet. Because maybe it's not about what you're keeping out. It's about what you're brave enough to invite in. So last weekend, I visited my uncle's house. He lives out by the lake. One of those cozy wooden places with wide windows and a front porch that always smells like cedar and old stories. We were just sitting there, sipping tea out of mismatched mugs, when I noticed this little glass jar tucked near his altar. It was filled with salt, but also had something else inside. A shiny coin, a tiny leaf, and what looked like a piece of paper folded real small. I asked, "Uncle, what's in there?" He smiled like he'd been waiting for that question. And he said, "Salt keeps things clean, but luck needs something to hold on to." That sentence, it stayed with me the whole drive home, because I've always kept a salt jar, but I'd never thought of giving it a gift back. If you've ever felt like your money luck just stays still, like something's missing but you can't name it, this might be it. Stay with me till the end. I'll share how one small item inside your salt jar could open a new flow. And if this resonates with you, there's a whole salt rituals playlist waiting, full of quiet shifts that change everything. Some people don't even realize they're doing magic. They just do what their grandparents did. And somehow, their luck always flows. I used to think salt was just salt. Something static, something dry. But when I visited my uncle that weekend, I noticed something that made me question everything. There, sitting on the windowsill by his kitchen, was a salt jar with a coin inside, a real old coin. And somehow, the whole house just felt charged. You know, I did have a salt jar. I even placed it neatly on my counter right where I thought energy would flow. But if I'm being honest, I didn't really think about it. I just did what a blog said. Put salt in, close the lid, done. And for months, it just sat there, still, silent, gathering dust, slowly, almost like it was reflecting exactly what I was feeling inside. I never asked what it meant. I never chose the salt with any intention. I never added anything that spoke to me. And you know what's funny? Every time I passed by that jar, my eyes sort of glazed over. It became invisible like furniture, a lifeless little thing in a corner of my life. And I kept wondering why things in my world felt stuck. I blamed the economy. I blamed my schedule. I even blamed Mercury retrograde a few times. But deep down, something kept whispering, "You're not connecting." It wasn't just about having a salt jar. It was about what I put into it. And truthfully, mine was hollow, energetically and emotionally. Looking back, it makes so much sense. Every time I walked past that jar, I didn't feel anything. No activation. No spark. My space felt untouched. And worse me finances? They flatlined. No growth. Just maintenance. It was like I'd put effort into rituals, but nothing clicked. So one morning, I just stood there, looking at that little jar like it was the first time I'd really seen it. It was dusty. The salt inside had clumped, just slightly. It felt tired, like me, and I whispered, "Okay, let's try again." I emptied the old salt out gently, like I was releasing something stale. I rinsed the jar with warm water and a drop of lemon mim, That citrus scent was oddly comforting. It felt like I was wiping away a layer of hesitation. Then, I chose my salt. This time, intentionally. I held the crystals in my palm for a moment, just long enough to breathe a little wish into them. Not a big one, just something soft and quiet. Let energy move again, and then I added something else. Something small, personal. A dried bay leaf with my name on it. A coin from the year I started over, and a thread of red string-tied loosely, like a promise I hadn't given up on. I sealed the jar, placed it back where it always sat. But now, it wasn't just a jar. It was mine, infused with meaning, alive with story. The next morning, I lit a small candle beside it. The sun was coming through the window just right, and something about it felt aligned. That week, I got 2 unexpected messages. One about a freelance job, the other from someone who owed me money. Both said yes. And the funny thing is, I wasn't surprised. It felt natural, like the jar had opened a forgotten door. You know what's strange? Nothing flashy happened. No sudden luck. No winning lottery ticket. But something did shift. That night, the air in the room felt softer, like something had exhaled. I lit a candle near the jar knot for ritual, just because. And the light flickered in this oddly calming way, bouncing gently off the glass. Over the next few days, I noticed small things. Bills I'd forgotten about, covered. A delayed refund showed up. A client I hadn't heard from in months reached out with a new project. And internally, I just felt clearer. No more dragging myself through decisions. No more that weird sense of ugh every morning. It was like I'd unblocked a tiny valve in my space. And money, energy, could finally breathe again. So yeah, it was still just a salt jar. But now, it welcomed the flow instead of trapping it. Salt holds space, but intention lights the spark. And that spark, it made me wonder, what else could be placed inside to keep the flow moving? You'd think salt is enough, right? But what if it's the second ingredient that unlocks the real magic? I used to believe that salt alone did all the work. I mean, it's purifying, grounding, ancient. But then my uncle said something I didn't expect. Salt holds space, but something else has to speak the intention. And that changed the way I saw the entire ritual. I really thought I was doing it right. Just a jar of salt clean. Simple, powerful. I placed it near the front door, in the bathroom, even next to my wallet. It looked tidy, quiet, peaceful even. Somehow, nothing changed. No shift, no movement, no energy. And it bothered me. I kept wondering, why isn't this working? It wasn't until I talked to my uncle that something clicked. He said gently, "Salt can clear, yes, but it doesn't guide unless you tell it where to go." That hit me so hard, because suddenly, I realized every jar I made was just sitting there, a blank. No message, no intention. It was like placing an empty frame on the wall and expecting it to become art. I had unintentionally turned my salt ritual into a passive act. I thought the salt would do something on its own, but instead, it was just holding space without direction, without flow. And that hit different, because I started to feel like maybe it wasn't about whether the salt was pure, but whether my intention was missing entirely. I started noticing the pattern. I'd do the salt jar thing, feel good for a day or two, then nothing. No clarity. No flow. Bills still felt heavy. I'd open my wallet and feel a little sigh. That low-key feeling of, why does abundance feel so far? And still, I blamed myself. Maybe I didn't cleanse it right. Maybe the moon was wrong. But the real reason? The jar had no energy direction. Just quiet crystals sitting there. So that night, I went back to my little salt jar. It was just sitting there, silent, plain, a bit dusty on the rim. I picked it up gently, almost like cradling something asleep, and I whispered, "You need a reason to be here, don't you?" I opened the lid, poured out half the salt, and then, carefully, I placed one thing inside. A folded note. It wasn't fancy. Just a tiny scrap of paper torn from my old journal. On it, I wrote one sentence. I am open to peaceful abundance. Then I sealed the jar again, slowly poured the salt back in, layered it over like snow covering a secret wish, and set it right by my window where the morning light could touch it. Something felt different. Not dramatic, not loud, but anchored. Like my energy had finally sent out a clear signal, and the universe had somewhere to respond. That night, I left the lights dimmed, let the quiet linger, and I fell asleep with a little more softness in my chest. The next morning, something quiet happened. I was making coffee half awake, still wrapped in my blanket, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from a client I hadn't heard from in months. Just one line. "Hey, are you available for a session this week?" I smiled. Not because of the money, but because something had unjammed. Like a little door inside me had clicked open. Later that afternoon, I sat by the window, right where the salt jar was. The light hit it gently. The folded note inside glowed faintly under the salt. And for some reason, I felt emotional, not tearful, just present. I realized it wasn't just a jar anymore. It was a little promise, a tiny altar, a moment I had created with intention, and that moment was now creating something back. It was small, but deeply personal, and it felt like a beginning. Ever since I placed that tiny note inside the salt, there's been a shift. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniably real. The room where the jar sits, it feels warmer, almost like it breathes easier. I've noticed myself lingering there longer, without even realizing why. Emails flow smoother. Payments come in without delay. Even small wins like finding a lost check or getting a referral out of the blue have started to layer in. But more than that, I've felt clearer, like my thoughts are no longer tangled in invisible strings. Every time I glance at that salt jar, I don't just see a container. I see a choice I made to name what I needed, to believe it could shift, and to give it a place to land. And somehow, money has responded. Not like a lottery win, but like a quiet guest who finally feels safe enough to come through the door. Salt holds space, but your word directs the flow. And once I understood that, I started wondering what else could I place inside. Let's try something even more personal. You ever hold a coin and feel something? Not the weight, but the memory, the hope, like it's been waiting to be placed somewhere that matters. I used to think coins were just coins. Loose change at the bottom of a purse. Something you toss into a jar without thinking. But I didn't realize the first coin you place into your salt jar. It's not just metal, it's intention. And if it's chosen wrong, it can trap more than just money. So, for the longest time, my salt jar sat there, clean, neat, but completely empty. No symbol, no energy, just plain white salt in a glass jar. At first I thought, well, salt is enough, right? I mean, it's protective, it absorbs. But here's the thing I hadn't really thought about. Salt cleanses, but it doesn't invite. It's like wiping a table spotless, but never setting anything on it. No flowers, no fruit, no intention. I realized I had created a void, a space that repels negativity. Yes, but doesn't call in abundance. And energy? Oh, it noticed. The jar just sat there, like a pause in the middle of my shelf. It didn't feel bad, but it didn't feel alive either. And when I finally looked at it with fresh eyes, I actually whispered to myself, why does this feel so blank? That's when I knew. Salt alone was the start. But it needed something more. Every time I walked past the salt jar, I felt uneasy, like something wasn't clean. Even the salt looked dull. There was no shift, no lightness, just a weird, silent heaviness. And strangely, I found myself worrying more about money, checking my accounts obsessively, feeling tight, clenched. I couldn't explain it. But that jar, it felt stuck, just like me. So I did something small. One of those, let's just try this kind of moments. I looked around my room and spotted a tiny brass coin I'd kept from a trip to San Francisco. It wasn't rare, it wasn't expensive, but it had a warmth to it, like a memory that still made me smile. I picked it up, held it in my hand, and just breathed. Then I gently placed it right in the center of the salt. Something about that motion, placing something meaningful into something cleansing, it felt sacred. Like I wasn't just hoping for luck, I was inviting it. Then I added a single dried bay leaf, crisp, light, almost too delicate to hold. But a heat shifted the whole jar. Suddenly, it wasn't just salt. It became a magnet, a quiet signal to the universe saying, I'm ready now, you can come in. And the moment I stepped back and looked at it, goosebumps. Truly. It felt like that jar was no longer blank. It was whispering something back to me. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The idea of putting a wish in the salt felt kinda silly at first. But then I remembered something. Back when I was 12, my grandmother used to keep a tiny jar of salt and mint leaves by her bedroom window. She once told me, when your heart wants something, but your hands can't reach it yet, whisper it into the salt. I never forgot that. So, I did it. I scribbled down a small intention, not even a full sentence. Just a word, flow. Folded it tight, held it gently for a second, and tucked it inside the salt jar. No big ritual. No candle. Just a quiet moment. And somehow, it felt complete. Like I had made a little agreement with the universe. The next few days felt different. I wasn't expecting magic, but the energy, it shifted. Emails that had gone unanswered suddenly got replies. A friend who owed me money randomly Venmo'd me back. And more than anything, I felt clear, less frantic, like I wasn't pushing so hard just to keep up. The salt jar sat there on the shelf, barely noticeable, but every time I glanced at it, there was this soft reminder. You're supported. You've set the intention. Now let it flow. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And wow, it made me trust the process again. Salt remembers what you whisper and releases it when you're ready. And if that sounds wild, just wait until you hear this next part. 1. Add a personal wealth symbol. Don't just drop in any object. Choose something that means something. Maybe it's an old coin you've kept in your wallet for years. Or a small, smooth stone you picked up on a day everything just worked out. Hold it in your hand for a moment. Let yourself remember that feeling. Then gently place it in the salt jar, like a quiet wish. Whisper to yourself, "Let this hold the memory of abundance," and call it back to me. It's small, but wow, it makes the jar feel yours. 2. Refresh the salt during the new moon. Salt absorbs both good and bad. So, every new moon, make it a ritual. Slowly pour out the old salt. Clean the jar with warm water. Wipe it down. As you do, say softly, "I release what no longer serves." Then pour in fresh salt slowly, like sand falling in an hourglass. Imagine each grain as a new opportunity, a clean start, a quiet yes. It's amazing how something so simple can feel so cleansing. 3. Let the jar breathe with gentle airflow. You don't need a big setup. Just place the salt jar near a soft, natural current, like a cracked window, or a hallway where air quietly passes. Why? Because salt needs movement. Energy needs breath. If it sits too still, it becomes heavy, just like our lives do. Let a breeze pass through. Let it carry your intentions. Watch how the space feels lighter, and you do too. I didn't think much of it, honestly. Just salt in a jar. But that day, standing in my uncle's kitchen, he looked at me and said, "It only works if you put a piece of yourself in it." That stuck with me. So when I came home, I didn't just toss salt in a bowl. I paused. I breathed. I thought about the things I wanted to clear and the things I wanted to call in. And now, every time I walk past that little jar near the door, I smile just a bit. Because it's quiet, but it's working. Not loud, not dramatic, just gently shifting things back into place. So if something in this story stirred something in you, tell me in the comments, what would you add to your salt jar? And hey, if you loved this, go explore our Salt Rituals playlist. It's full of the tiniest things that shift everything. See you in the next one, and may your flow always find its way back to you.